talk to me? stays on. Because it was going red on me.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
As always.
As always.
All right, everybody. I think we'll get started. You know what they say about Rochester weather. Wait 5 minutes, and here we are. 5 minutes ago, I think it was 50, and now look at it. Craziness. Kiara is well versed in this weather, so you're not surprised. Welcome to this session of the Diversity Conference, Race, Culture, and Journalism, the Role of Reporters in a Divided Country. My name is Kim Young. I'm a professor in the journalism program here at SUNY Brockport, and I am your moderator today, and I'm so happy to see all of you here. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy lives to join us. It is my great pleasure and certainly my distinct honor to introduce you to one of my all-time favorite students, the speaker of today, Kiara Alfonseca. Kiara earned a Bachelor of Science in Journalism and Creative Writing here at SUNY Brockport in 2018. She is currently working as a race and culture reporter and producer at ABC News, Good Morning America, and 538. In her role, her coverage mainly focuses on social injustice, education, policing, and hate in America. Previously, she worked at HuffPost as a video producer, focusing on breaking news and politics. As a student here, she interned or earned a fellowship at organizations including ProPublica, NBC News, Rochester City Newspaper, and WROC-TV. She also worked at The Stylist, the campus newspaper, starting as a copy editor in her freshman year, and then becoming an editor-in-chief in her junior year. Just to let you know, following Kiara's presentation, there will be a question and answer session. There's a microphone for those of you who have, I'm sure, many questions about what Kiara is about to present. So please join me in welcoming Kiara Alfonseca.
Stay limber. Ooh-wee. Okay, can you guys hear me? Great. Okay, well, first start off by saying that there's a reason I am a digital reporter, not an on-camera reporter. Public speaking freaks me out. So just bear with me today, and hopefully we'll make it through. Thank you so much for coming out despite whatever this is that's going on. I really do appreciate you taking the time to come and listen to me. And also, I guess before I get started, I want to thank the journalism folks in the room. I owe the journalism department, the English department, everything, because of they're what got me to where I am today. So if I could get a round of applause for our professors. Woo! Okay, well, thank you so much. Okay, so yeah, as was mentioned, my name is Kiara Alfonseca. I'm a reporter and producer at ABC News, and I focus on race and culture specifically. And so what that means is I essentially look at breaking news, any ongoing issues, anything that's trending, and try to dissect it through the lens of identity. So kind of every day we're reminded of the ways that identity intersects with how the world sees us, how the world treats us, who we are and how we present ourselves to the world affects everything in our lives. And so that's kind of what I try to unpack. And I know that some people are tired of talking about identity. We hear this term identity politics all the time, but it's so tied to how we exist in the world. Some people don't have the luxury to stop talking about identity. And so you might not feel it, you might not acknowledge it, but identity affects everything in the world around us. And so my job is to unpack that and explain it to you. It's a very tough job, and I just want to preface this with also, I'm not an expert. I think part of my job is literally learning every day. I am not every identity, and therefore every day on the job is a research experiment, and I'm constantly listening and learning and growing. And so later in this presentation, I do want to have kind of like conversation amongst ourselves. And so I want to stress that this is a safe space, right? This is for open dialogue of people of every background can talk openly and freely and feel like there's no judgment. So I want to make sure that is clear throughout this discussion. So I forgot my clicker. That's who I am. Talked about that already. So why should you care? Not only are we just, affected by identity, each and every one of us, but this whole theme is, what is the role of reporters in a divided world? The people who are speaking to you, telling you what you should care about, why you should care about this. For the longest time, journalists have approached the world from a very limited point of view, only because the industry was it was white dominated, it was male dominated, it was from a very limited perspective through the white lens, male lens, able-bodied lens, straight lens. So when articles are being pitched, when communities are being reported on, when things are being written, they weren't necessarily written with the idea of intersectionality in mind. And so intersectionality is when different identities come together and kind of coincide, supersede one another, and impact each other in layered ways. And so that's why so many, and I talked about this in my panel earlier, why so many independent outlets grew in news media. So we have Black news outlets, we have Hispanic-led news outlets, we have queer, gender-based outlets, because those communities were not being served. And so journalism is, in a way, a service industry. We tell you what you need to know, whether it's how to get up to work on time, whether it's what the weather is going to be, if it's to call out your public officials for doing things wrong, or to be fully informed at the ballot box. It's a service industry. And I think some people, will argue that it might not be, but it is very interesting to think of it this way. And so in summer 2020, a lot of us really took a look at how we were doing things. We wanted to ask, what voices are we uplifting? Who are we giving a platform? Should we be giving hate groups a platform? What does that do for our coverage, and what does that do for the people that we serve? And so we also were asking, are marginalized people being given the space, or are we perpetuating some kind of inequality in our work, the same inequality that we're supposed to be reporting on and dismantling? And so not only is it just that you should be getting quality news, but I also think it's important that for you, in whatever major you are, and whatever field you end up in, you also start to kind of look at the world in this way. Like, how does identity intersect with the world that I live in, with the job that I do? And so if you're going into healthcare, criminal justice, political science, you should also be asking, how can you address inequality based on identity? What is your role in a divided world in addressing inequalities? And so I think these conversations are just so vital to kind of dissecting this issue of division and identity and understanding our world and how to fix the inequities in our society, because if we understand each other, we can make the world a better place, which is so corny to say, but I think it's true. And if you don't want to address inequalities, that's fine, that's up to you, but I think there's no harm in asking, is someone being left behind? What happens if we forget them? What can we do so they're not? And so I just want to take a second, and I want you to kind of think about your identities. And these can be, race, but this can also be a plethora of identities. So everyone just close your eyes for a second, right? Be one with yourself. So think about the way that you identify. Are you Black, Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous, white? Think about your heritage. But also think beyond race and culture. You probably think of those things first in our current political climate, but race and culture means a lot of things. It extends beyond how we look and what heritage we have. So are you a woman? Are you a man? Non-binary, trans? A citizen? An immigrant? Have you been incarcerated? Are you able-bodied or disabled? Queer, straight, wealthy, low income? Do you have an accent? There are just so many things about our identity that you should be thinking about. And you can open your eyes now. But I want to, focus on this quote from Audre Lorde that says, "There's no thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." And that's kind of how I approach reporting. When a shooting happens, I think, who is impacted by this most? When I think about gun violence, I think, who is impacted by this most? Climate change, again, health inequality, wealth inequality, racial inequality, thinking about who is at the bottom and what can we do to lift them up. And so I think it's not enough to say this thing affects this group of people. You have to also look into the cogs and the machines and pick apart what needs to be fixed and what is behind those issues, as I mentioned. So why does this disparity and inequities exist? And it doesn't just, the question that we should be asking ourselves is not just what is the issue that exists, but why does this exist? And so I want to take a look at some of the stories about how identity is at the core of some of ABC News' work and how these issues often intersect with many other issues being faced by various identities. So a women's issue, then you can look at it from a Black woman's issue. You can look at it from a queer person's issue, and so on and so forth. So gender, race, all of these things intersect and can differently affect how we experience the world. So I'll kind of show some headlines. And so why extreme heat endangers more Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous people? And one of the first Twitter comments I got was, how can heat be racist? Which, fair question, I guess. But when we think about climate change and weather or natural disasters, we have to think about our most vulnerable populations and why they're vulnerable in this case. So we took a look at the populations that have increased chances of heat-related illnesses and death, which happen to be Black and brown folks. And kind of at the root of this is that not all cities and towns are created equal. So Black and brown folks are more likely to live in urban heat islands, which is essentially poor urban planning where a lot of the natural green lands are removed and replaced with pavements, buildings, and other materials that retain and absorb heat. And so this is also caused by redlining and housing discrimination that push Black and brown communities into neighborhoods with less trees, less green spaces, and heavier traffic. And so initially, when you look at this, you're like, how can heat be racist? And it's not that heat is racist, but it's about the systems that we have in place make heat more dangerous for some people rather than others. And on top of this, we can also talk about healthcare and accessibility and access to healthy foods, quality insurance that can also affect how Black and brown people are more likely to experience cardiovascular, respiratory diseases, which also makes extreme heat more dangerous for these populations. So, and then I think solutions journalism is also a very important part of this thing, of this whole idea of what is the role of journalism, especially in today's society. And solutions journalism is very focused on how do we fix things. And I think that's an interesting thing for any journalist in the room to maybe implement in their reporting is, okay, how do we point out not just the problem, but the solution? What are people doing to fix this problem already? Is it working? What is the research? And so this, we discuss a little bit about that. So let's see. There we go. There's my solutions journalism. So guaranteed income. When some people think of guaranteed income, they're like, woo, free money. I who doesn't love free money? But guaranteed income programs have actually seen a resurgence in recent years. They attempt to address racial and economic inequality and poverty. And this specific experiment focuses on Black women. And that's because in Atlanta, 38% of Black women are living in poverty, compared to 8% of white women and 5% of white men in the same city. So poverty and food insecurity have a big impact on someone's mental, physical health, and it's even considered by some to be one of the most serious and costly health problems, poverty. And so studies and research also had found that basic income experiments improved happiness and improved health, and also affected crime rates in the areas that received guaranteed income experiments. And so this was a really good example of highlighting solutions that can really impact and better this inequality that we're pointing out. And I know a lot of people might be like, well, I am white and I am poor. I could use guaranteed income. Well, this, after this income experiment, we've actually seen a lot of other similar experiments being posed for people who are incarcerated, single mothers, people with disabilities, and other populations that also face barriers to security. So when we think about the compounding identities that are affected by, let's say, this issue of poverty, here we have them intersecting. Black women, people with disabilities, could be Black women with Black women with disabilities, and so on and so forth. And I'll kind of put away my notes because this just happened. I'm sure everyone has heard of the Nashville shooting that happened recently. And as soon as I heard that the police had said that the shooter was reportedly trans, I knew it was going to happen. I've been covering anti-LGBT legislation for years now. I've done articles about the false narratives concerning the trans community, calling them groomers, calling them pedophiles, so on and so forth. And I knew what was going to happen when this identity came out. It was going to be used used almost immediately by political figures focusing on misinformation, implying that the trans identity had in some way been inherently involved with the motive, and that the community is inherently violent because of this. And this is kind of a stereotype that has long and historically been used against the LGBTQ community. And I think when you look at this, you might be saying, well, why don't you focus on the victims? And we did. We have so many articles on the victims. But there's also a very long-lasting potential pain and damage against the trans community that is innocent in this case. Not the shooter, but the community that's already been attacked by legislation, by hateful rhetoric. Trans people are already 4 times more likely to be victims of violence. And in the experts that we spoke to who have covered mass shootings and violence and crimes say that trans people are more likely to be victims than perpetrators, vastly more likely. And so in an attempt to combat misinformation, this was so important to do a story on this, because almost to stop misinformation and anti-trans sentiment in its track, to say there's no proof that trans folks are more likely to be violent. And this is almost, well, yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll leave it there. It was a heavily charged night for us following this, kind of watching #transterrorism trend on Twitter. If that kind of gives you more insight into what we were kind of battling and facing. And that's more, okay. And so this is another one that I think is very close to home. We were literally just talking about it 5 minutes ago. The Buffalo, New York shooting was inherently about hate and about identity. Buffalo is one that is probably close to a lot of people here. It was in our backyard. I know a lot of Buffalo folks who went to this school with me, and so I know this is very close to home, so I hope this isn't too triggering for anyone. But yeah, in this case, there were documents that detailed the hate, the racism that motivated the attack that killed several black people in Buffalo in a grocery store. And so when we think about that hate, that motivation, one of the things that we made sure to do or not to do was give a platform to the extremists, right? When we think about far-right extremism, do you give a microphone to white supremacists and say, what is your side of the story? You know, when the two sides are black people are existing in a grocery store, the other side isn't. Why should black people be able to exist in a grocery store? And so I think this was a moment when we kind of really stepped back and tried to understand, what does showing two sides in journalism mean? What is being objective? What does that look like in a case when you're faced with white supremacists? And so all of our coverage that came out of this was, how do we really address this really intense issue of far-right extremism in the U.S. And so we kind of looked at it from a lot of different points of just like, maybe we should focus on Black Pride and Juneteenth and learning what it means to people now following this kind of intense attack. In other cases, I've been looking at the massive effort to ban certain books, especially books from or written about people of color or queer people, and what does that mean for our education system if people cannot get their hands on books about the civil rights movement, about basic history, about Black important figures in the United States. What does that mean, and what will that lead us to? And so a lot of educators spoke out about that, about how taking race out of education could fuel white nationalism, which was really interesting. And then also why, there's this label called the lone wolf when we think about white supremacists who, for, in this example, attacked based and motivated by hate. And the truth is that they aren't alone. There is a very deep, now that we know, a deep internet community, and obviously this extends beyond the internet, of white supremacists, of far-right extremists, who the FBI has been spending years to kind of wrangle and control. And so the Center for, I'll read some stats about radicalization and why we focus so heavily on not necessarily like a solutions, but trying to unpack the problem that we have and what it means for us. So the Center for Strategic and International Studies found that alleged right-wing attacks and plots have accounted for the majority of all U.S. terrorist incidents since 1994. And the last 2 years, 2021 and 2020, were the highest recorded years of domestic terrorism plots and attacks, so the trends are pretty concerning, as what the Senior Vice President for the CSIS told me. And so since 2014, these kinds of attacks and plots have been on the rise. And so we really wanted to zero in and look at the identity aspect of this to kind of point out that this is a problem and we need to figure out a solution. And Uvalde, Texas. I'm sorry my work is so depressing. I wish I had some joyful news for you. But yeah, so I got to go to Uvalde, Texas after the school shooting there for several months. And it was probably the most transformative journalism experience I've had. And I think when a lot of people think of this, they think, the children, the schools, and they don't really think about identity, but that was one thing, not only is my beat race and culture, but it is a predominantly Hispanic community, and that immediately stood out to me. I wanted to know not only how do I connect to them, because being a brown face in a sea of white reporters was, it was an automatically a connection for us, and it made people a lot more comfortable. So representation in newsrooms is very important. But we wanted to take a look at how identity intersects with the issue of gun violence, especially in Texas, where you find most of the mass shootings happening even this year. And so we the El Paso massacre. We wanted to take a look at how that has impacted and reopened wounds for folks since the El Paso massacre was a targeted attack, specifically on the Hispanic community. We wanted to take a look at how there's a lot of stigma in the Latino community against mental health care and mental illness, and what are people doing to solve it, especially because a lot of the mental health counselors that were coming in, I walked in and I was like, you all are not Hispanic. And so it was a lot of white counselors coming in. They're like, how do we connect to this community? And it wasn't like me kind of projecting. It was literally talking to the residents, and they're being like, who are these people? We don't know them. They're from out of town. And how can we trust them with what the trauma that we are going through? And also the counselor is telling me, we do not look like them. There are so many barriers that we have to overcome. How do we work through this? And I was like, I don't know the answer. That's not my job. But I was there to at least be there to cover this kind of nuanced battle that was going on, and how a lot of Latino communities around the country kind of also face a very similar issue of not having access to mental health care, and what does that mean for the community. And this photo project, I highly recommend you all go home and look at it immediately. I recommend a desktop to watch it. I love these children. They're so adorable. We gave them all cameras to show us their world in their own eyes. And I think after a tragedy like this, we talked to some therapists about what we should do and how we should tell the story. And we wanted to give the control back to the children who did not have control in that moment when the shooting happened. And so this was a really almost therapeutic way for them to tell us what they want us to know, and whether it's about the shooting or whether it's not, whether it's just look at this place I love in Uvalde, right? Just showing us the city, how it was going to be rebuilt, how it was recovering. And I feel like that is such an important tool for us to learn from, like journalists, I mean, for you guys, but also for us. I felt like it was so much more impactful to give them the mic and tell us what they wanted us to know, which in communities, especially communities of color that are going through trauma, is not something that they see very often. It's a journal. We talked about this earlier in the panel, but journalists come in, they swoop, they vulture, and then they leave. Buffalo, which happened, I want to say a week. I might be messing up the date, so don't stress me on it, off the record. But Buffalo happened shortly before Uvalde, and we go back now. We're still in communication with the folks there, and they're like, "What happened? We have no resources. The resources Uvalde got, we do not have. The sea of reporters that we still have in Uvalde, we still have reporters in Buffalo." But what about all the other networks? What about all the other folks kind of remembering, especially as an anniversary comes up? They're like, where are you? And so I think keeping in mind identity, how that impacts people, being there and revisiting these kinds of topics over and over again are just really important to hearing those voices and hearing what they have to say. Okay. And so now that we've talked about identity and all of the ways that it intersects with our lives and the world as it's burning, I would love to have a little discussion amongst yourselves to talk about, since you did, think a little bit more about your identity, the different ways that you identify. If you could talk a little bit amongst yourselves about a recent news event or issue that impacts you based on your identity. And again, this is a safe space, so feel free to divulge as much as you would like or as little. And if you don't have a partner, feel free to flag me over, I'll come. But yeah, take a second to talk amongst yourselves and think a little bit about it. Okay, I'll do 5 more minutes. I don't want to interrupt because I'm sure you all were having very intense conversations. If I could interest anyone, would anyone like to share what they discussed? I'm happy to go first because I know we're a shy crowd. Oh, yes! Oh, come on up.
Oh, okay, great. Hi. We were talking about the school shootings that have been happening recently, especially the one in Michigan State. Being a college student, you just relate to that more and more. I actually have a friend who also attends Michigan State, so it's interesting seeing all this constantly happening. I also have siblings who are still in high school, and that also is very traumatic, seeing these school shootings happening once a week now, it feels like, or almost every other day. And we just could really relate to that as students, I think.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Okay.
Yeah. I did an article the other day that there have been more mass shootings than days in 2023, to put that into perspective. So thank you so much for sharing. It's rough out here. Does anyone else want to share? Anyone?
So we kind of got off topic from the news events a little bit, but
okay.
She was talking about how when she tells her son certain stuff to stay safe, it's completely different from like what my mom told me. My parents were always very protective of us, and they tried to make sure we were always safe. But hearing her say that, her son, who's Dominican and Puerto Rican, saying that he can't wear a hood, or that he has to be careful when driving because he may get pulled over just because of how he looks, while my mom tells me she doesn't want me to get pulled over because of speeding. It's just totally different, because still protective, but just a totally different outlook on it. And as she was saying, just opposite sides of the coin.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. No, I think that's a perfect example of how we all move through the world in different ways, just depending on our different identities. I want to give anyone else a chance before we go.
So we were kind of talking about Roe v. Wade and how over the summer that was like a huge thing on our minds to see. In New York, I mean, I guess for us it's a little better because we don't really have to worry about that. But, being a senior in college, wondering where I want to live next year, I never thought that would also be something that I would have to take into consideration. So, yeah, that's definitely a big thing in the news.
Yeah, that was actually the same topic Marcia and I also discussed. And it's so interesting how divided our country is getting, just literally based on state now, because similar things are also, I mentioned I was reporting on trans issues. Trans people are fleeing states. Like, people are literally raising funds to move because of the laws. And same with Roe v. Wade. People are like, I want to be able to have an abortion, whatever the reason, and moving to do so. So it's so interesting to see the way that literally state by state we're a patchwork of political issues. Well, anyone else? Going once? Going twice? Okay, well, I guess I'll just leave it open to questions. I don't want to keep jabbering on. If anyone has any questions for me about race and culture reporting. No is also okay.
So we talked about this earlier, how as journalists we tend to swoop in and swoop out. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, your vested effort in Uvalde, Texas, but the public is, not wanting to have in-depth reporting or longer reporting on issues. I can guarantee you next week we won't be talking about Nashville, Tennessee any longer. What is the role of a journalist to keep a story like that, the larger stories that are around that, not just of the people, but the larger political issues? What do you think, as a journalist, is your responsibility and our responsibility as a society to pay attention?
Kim, you're always getting me with those deep sigh questions. I think that's a great question. And it's so hard because I always think about, and I've been just kind of really pondering this specific idea about the politics of destruction. We cannot focus on things long enough because then comes the next thing. Like there's a shooting one day and then, the president might get indicted, and then, there's a tornado that has flattened an impoverished community, and then, another black man has been beaten by police. It's literally every day. How do we possibly keep up with everything? And also, can we emotionally, even humanly keep up with everything in an, inhumane news cycle? That's a great question. But I think beyond that, I think that is my very role, is making us remember. And that's why we return. I mean, yes, in Uvalde, we're literally there for the entire year, but that won't be the last time we're there. We're going to be there every year, probably every half year, every time something with gun violence happens. With Uvalde, for example, and even with Club Q, if you remember Club Q in Colorado Springs, I'll be there. Even with this latest shooting, we have people from Sandy Hook, we have people from Parkland, we have people from Buffalo, Uvalde reaching out to survivors. There's a huge network, especially with, for example, shooting survivors, of people now speaking out again, to each other, because they don't want us to forget, and they are inherent, if by their own means making us remember. So I think my literal job is to not let us forget. Which is a hard job because, again, everything is fighting for our attention. And it's like, how do you pick the trans issue of the day versus the police brutality issue of the day versus the poverty issue of forever? It's tough. I don't know. That's my answer. I'm trying. Okay, I did see a hand over. Okay. 1, 2. Oh. Come over here. Hi.
So obviously you were talking about how you're covering all of these traumatic events, and it is one right after another. As a journalist, how do you take care of yourself? Because I know you're taking care of so many other people. How do you make sure that your mental health is?
That's a great question, and we actually we got this in my panel earlier, and long story short, I was very bad at that for so long. It affected my physical health. And that's when I started. Once it started, my body was literally telling me, you need to stop and take a break, was when I finally took a break. And I think, actually, let me start with, I can't say the direct quote because I can't remember it. But I'll leave their name out of it too. I spoke to a very prominent journalist who had a very big New York Times project, the 1619 Project, and this who I will not name, big fan. And she said to me, and this has been kind of my guiding star, I think, since she said it to me. There is so much hope in knowing that all of this inequity does not have to exist. She's like, there's so much hope in the fact that we created this system of inequity, because that means that we can tear it down, and that none of none of the bad things that we are facing are inherent to who we are as humans, and that is so hopeful for her. And I think that's what's been kind of keeping me afloat, is okay, when I report on inequities, I know there's solutions. I know we can find them, and I know people have already started to work on those, so let's focus on those. And then also make sure you're like doing things that you love and taking your vacation time. If you've got a job, make sure that you're sleeping well, you're eating well, you're literally just doing everything, keeping a routine. And yeah, definitely make time for the things that you love, and don't forget to do that. Big fan.
Big fan, bigger fan, older fan. First of all, congratulations to you and all your success and all the things that you're doing and that you're going to do. When you were here as a student, we all knew that you were going to be successful. You were already successful in class, and I remember your final project in contemporary media issues. So this is my question, and this is actually for our students. What in your Brockport education helped you to become the person that you are now, the professional that you are now? And if you answered that before, I didn't hear it, so.
Oh, okay. I can't just pick one thing. Okay. It's so funny. I mean, first of all, media law, very important. But I don't think that's it. Again, media ethics, very important. But I would say it wasn't necessarily anything in the content, but rather the people. And I think that people part of things is what's going to get you to wherever you need to go. Because again, I will always thank the professors from every department for helping me, for being a great support system, even though I was a wacko when I was here, I'll tell you that. Again, make sure you're sleeping, because I did not sleep. I highly recommend it. And I will also say the student media, I learned so much. There were so many nights way too late at night where we would be there at 2 a.m. editing things, arguing about how we want to cover something, how we want to design something. We'd spend, Monday, Tuesday mornings, talking about the issues on campus. How do we cover them? Again, spending hours at the police department because they don't want to give us a statement. Or, maybe I shouldn't mention this. I'm going to. When the rugby girls stole my newspapers, I'm going to stand by it. I'm telling you, I went through a lot here at Brockport. And there were just so many times when the stylist and the journalism department had my back and was so supportive in this whole entire journey that I'll be thankful for. So the people. And I know people call it networking. I just call it friendship building. Like, if it feels too transactional and you're just looking to get a review of your resume, nuh-uh. I want you to ask me how my date was. I want you to be nice to me and be my friend. And I think that's what gets you farther in the industry anyway. Real genuine connections. I think networking is a bad term for it. But I have that answers. Any other questions? Drum roll. 3, 2, 1. Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming out today in the snowy weather.
Thank you, everybody. On behalf of the Diversity Conference Committee, I'd like to thank you for coming and taking your time out to welcome Kiara back to campus. And we'll be sending out a survey, so please take the time to comment on our programming for next year's Diversity Conference also. Thanks, everybody. And Kiara, love you.